I thought it was just a glance, but when she caught me watching and smiled, I realized nothing between us never meant for her to notice. At first, it was just a passing glance, the kind anyone might give without thought. She was sitting by the window, the soft light pouring over her, turning each loose strand of hair into something golden. There was a quiet elegance about her, the kind that doesn't try to demand attention, but somehow gathers it all the same. I should have looked away. I knew I should. But something about her presence held me still, like a song you don't want to end. My eyes lingered longer than they should have, tracing the way her lips parted slightly as she turned a page, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed. And then as she caught me, her gaze lifted, meeting mine with a steadiness that froze me in place. My heart kicked hard in my chest, panic sparking in the back of my throat. I expected the obvious, a frown, a raised brow, some quiet correction for looking too long at someone I shouldn't. But she didn't frown. She didn't turn away. She smiled. Not a wide, careless smile, but one that seemed to hold layers I couldn't quite name. It was soft, almost secretive, as though she had just discovered something between us that neither of us had spoken aloud. The air shifted in that moment. My breath felt heavier, the silence between us charged in a way that made me hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of the sunlight, the ticking clock in the hall, the sound of my own pulse in my ears. I looked down quickly, pretending to be absorbed in my phone, though the screen was nothing but a blur. That smile, gentle, knowing, was etched into me. And even without looking up again, I could feel it. It lingered like the faint brush of a hand across my skin, like warmth that refuses to fade. Inside, I wrestled with myself. She was older, wiser, someone I was supposed to see in only one way. But that single smile had unraveled the neat lines I thought I'd drawn. The strangest part? It didn't feel wrong. It felt human, like she had seen something in me, and instead of shutting it down, she had chosen to meet it, accept it, with quiet grace. I replayed it in my head long after she lowered her eyes back to her book. The curve of her lips, the softness of her expression, the calm in her gaze, it all carried weight. It wasn't flirtation, not exactly. It was something deeper. Permission, maybe, or understanding. And in that simple, fleeting exchange, I knew things had shifted. She had turned what could have been embarrassment into something warmer, more intimate. Something that would stay with me long after the moment itself had passed. That smile, unexpected, disarming, unforgettable, had changed the air between us. And though I couldn't name it yet, I knew nothing would feel the same again. Ever feel the same again. The sound of running water filled the kitchen when I walked in. She stood at the sink, sleeves rolled just above her elbows, rinsing a glass as though there was nowhere else she needed to be. The late afternoon light slanted across the counter, catching her profile in a way that made me pause at the doorway. For a moment, I just watched, silently, carefully. There was something grounding about her presence. Calm, steady, almost deliberate. She didn't rush, not with her movements, not with her words. "You're quiet today," she said, her voice soft but carrying enough to reach me without her turning around. The words startled me more than they should have. I wondered if she had noticed my silence all along, if she could feel the weight of everything I wasn't saying. "Just thinking," I replied, leaning against the frame. My voice sounded smaller than I intended, like it didn't quite belong to me. She set the glass aside and finally turned. Her eyes found mine with a patience that unsettled me, not because it was harsh, but because it was too gentle, too knowing. For a heartbeat, I felt seen in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. She smiled faintly, not the same smile as before, but something more restrained, more careful. Then, without a word, she stepped closer, reaching past me to place the glass on the counter. Her hand brushed against mine in the process, barely a touch, almost an accident, except it didn't feel accidental. The warmth of her skin lingered like a spark. My breath caught, and I glanced at her quickly, searching for meaning in her expression. But she didn't retreat. She only tilted her head slightly, as though acknowledging the moment without naming it. It was such a small thing, a passing touch in an ordinary kitchen, yet it carried a weight that pressed into me. I felt a dozen thoughts crowd my head. How close she was, how her perfume was faint but unmistakable, how the distance between us felt charged, fragile, and impossibly alive. She broke the silence first. "You don't have to overthink everything," she said quietly. her tone not scolding but almost reassuring. The words landed deeper than I expected. My throat tightened, and for once, I didn't have an answer. Her gaze softened then, as if she understood what I couldn't bring myself to say. And just like in the living room earlier, she chose not to push, not to name it, not to demand anything. Instead, she gave me space, yet at the same time, she closed the gap with that one lingering touch. When she finally stepped back, the air felt different. The kitchen seemed fuller, heavier, as if her nearness had left something behind. I stood there long after she turned back to the sink, my hand still tingling with the warmth of hers. And I knew, without words, that nothing between us was casual anymore. The evening came sooner than I expected. My friend had already headed upstairs, leaving me alone in the quiet of the living room. I gathered my things slowly, almost reluctantly, as if dragging out each small motion could somehow delay the inevitable moment of leaving. She appeared from the hallway just as I slipped my jacket over my shoulders. Her presence was calm, unhurried, though her eyes carried something I couldn't quite name. There was no need for words. She simply walked with me toward the door, her steps soft against the hardwood floor. When I reached for the handle, she stopped just short of me. For a second, neither of us moved. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with all the things unspoken, all the pauses and glances that had built quietly throughout the day. "Did you have a good time?" she asked, her tone light, but her gaze lingered longer than the question required. I nodded, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. "Yeah, more than I expected, actually." Her lips curved, that same knowing smile I'd seen earlier by the window. Only now, it felt fuller, heavier with meaning. She tilted her head, studying me as though she could read the layers I was too hesitant to voice. When her hand reached out, it wasn't deliberate at first, just a small touch at my arm, her fingers brushing the fabric of my jacket sleeve. But instead of pulling away, her hand rested there, warm and steady. The gesture was simple, almost motherly on the surface, but it lingered, and the stillness between us made it something else entirely. The warmth of her touch seeped deeper than skin. It softened something in me I hadn't realized was tense. I turned toward her, meeting her eyes fully now. And in that gaze, I saw not just confidence, but vulnerability too, a quiet confession that mirrored my own. "Thank you," I said softly, though I wasn't sure what I was thanking her for. Maybe for the smile earlier, maybe for the brush of her hand in the kitchen, maybe for the unspoken permission she gave me simply by not turning away. Her thumb moved slightly, the faintest motion against my arm, and the smallest breath of a laugh escaped her lips. "You don't have to thank me," she whispered, her voice almost lost to the hush of the room. It would have been so easy to lean closer, to let the moment tip into something undeniable. But neither of us crossed that line. Instead, she let her hand slip gently from my arm, her eyes holding mine 1 second longer before she glanced down, her composure returning like a quiet curtain. "Good night," she said, softer now, her words wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I stepped outside, the cool air meeting me, but her warmth clung to me still. As I walked down the path, I knew I carried more than just the memory of a smile or a touch. Something had shifted between us. Not spoken, not acted upon, but real. And it was enough to change the way I would remember this day for the rest of my life. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, but my mind wasn't. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, the events of the day playing over and over in loops I couldn't control. Each detail returned with surprising clarity. The way the sunlight caught in her hair, the brush of her hand against mine in the kitchen, the warmth of her palm on my arm as she walked me to the door. It was strange. None of these moments were loud. There had been no declarations, no sudden drama, no lines crossed. And yet, each fragment carried a weight that kept pressing into me, pulling me deeper into the memory. Her smile haunted me most of all, not because it was bold, but because it wasn't. It was subtle, layered, almost private, like she had let me glimpse a part of herself she didn't show easily. I kept asking myself why she smiled instead of looking away, why she touched my arm instead of keeping distance. Was it kindness? Reassurance? Or something she wasn't ready to put into words? I turned on my side, restless. The air felt thick, the room too small to contain what I was holding inside. My chest tightened at the thought of her standing so close to me, the faint trace of her perfume still lingering in my mind. I could almost feel the warmth of her hand again, as though it hadn't left me. A quiet conflict began to build. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to say I was imagining meaning where there was none. She was older, someone I wasn't supposed to think of this way. It would be easier, safer, to label it as a misunderstanding. And yet, it didn't feel like a misunderstanding. It felt intentional, even if neither of us said so. It felt like two people recognizing something they weren't expecting, something they weren't sure they were allowed to want. I thought about the vulnerability in her eyes at the door, how for one brief second, she seemed as unsure as I was. That image settled into me, quiet but undeniable. I pressed my hands against my face, torn between guilt and a warmth I couldn't shake. No matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the truth was simple. I wanted more. Not in some careless, reckless way, but in a way that longed for closeness, for the comfort and depth I had felt in those fleeting touches. Hours passed like that, me caught between reason and feeling, between the world's expectations and the private world that had opened between us that day. And still, as sleep finally began to edge in, one thought refused to let go. That smile, gentle, knowing, unforgettable, had changed me. Changed us. Whether I admitted it or not, nothing would be the same again. Morning light spilled across my room, but I barely felt rested. Sleep had come in fragments, broken by memories that returned as vividly as if they were still unfolding in front of me. The smile, the brush of her hand, the way her voice softened when she told me goodnight. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. It wasn't heavy in a painful way. It was heavy in the way something meaningful sits with you, something you can't ignore. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge it without running. What happened between us wasn't loud or reckless. It wasn't about forbidden lines or hidden motives. It was human. Two people finding an unspoken connection where neither expected it. The more I replayed it, the clearer it became. What made the day unforgettable wasn't just attraction. It was trust. In the way she let me see her softer edges. In the way she didn't pull away when my gaze lingered. In the way she allowed silence to say more than words ever could. And though I couldn't name exactly what this meant for the future, I knew it wasn't just a fleeting memory. It was a turning point. Part of me felt torn, hesitant about what others might think, uncertain about how to carry something that existed quietly between us. But another part, stronger now, felt grateful. Grateful for the warmth she offered, for the steadiness she carried, for the way she reminded me that connection doesn't follow rules of age or expectation. I thought of her laugh, soft and low, the way it seemed to carry both confidence and vulnerability at once. I thought of her eyes at the door, how they held mine just a moment too long, like she was silently asking me to remember. And I realized I didn't want to forget. I didn't need to, because sometimes the moments that matter most aren't the ones shouted into the world. They're the quiet ones, the smile that lingers, the touch that stays in your skin long after it's gone, the goodbye that feels like a promise of something more, even if it remains unspoken. As the morning stretched on, I felt calmer. The restless energy from the night before had settled into something gentler, something steady. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew this much. She had given me a gift, simply by allowing me to feel it, by not shutting the door on what stirred quietly between us. And whether it ever grew into something more, or stayed tucked within the folds of memory, it was enough. Enough to change the way I carried myself, enough to remind me what it feels like to be seen. Her smile had begun to shift. Her touch had deepened it. And now, the memory of both would stay with me, not as a weight, but as a warmth. The day she caught me watching hadn't just changed everything between us. In its quiet way, it had changed me too. Days passed, but the memory of that afternoon didn't fade the way I thought it might. If anything, it grew sharper in the quiet spaces, when I was alone with my thoughts, when a slant of sunlight reminded me of her by the window, when the faintest trace of her perfume seemed to rise from nowhere. At first, I thought the weight of it would overwhelm me, that every glance, every touch, every word would blur into confusion, leaving me restless and uncertain. But strangely, the opposite happened. The more I sat with it, the calmer I felt. There was no need to force meaning where it didn't belong. What we shared was real, but it didn't demand a definition. It was delicate, unspoken, built not on declarations but on trust and recognition. She hadn't turned away. I hadn't either. And that, in its own quiet way, was enough. I began to see the day not as a complication, but as a gift. A reminder that life sometimes offers us moments outside of expectation, moments that don't fit neatly into rules or labels, but still carry truth. Her smile had been more than kindness. It had been acknowledgement. Her touch had been more than comfort. It had been connection. And connection, I realized, doesn't need to be loud to matter. One evening, as I walked home, the air cooling around me, I caught myself smiling. The thought of her, steady, graceful, quietly vulnerable, brought a warmth that surprised me. Not the restless kind that kept me up at night, but a gentler warmth, the kind that steadies the heart. I no longer felt caught between guilt and desire. Instead, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the way she had allowed me to see her, and for the way she had seen me in return. Gratitude for the silence that had spoken more than words, for the stillness that had carried more than movement. Perhaps nothing more would come of it. Perhaps life would fold us back into our separate roles, with nothing but a quiet thread of memory tying us together. But even if that were true, I knew I wouldn't regret it. Some moments aren't meant to be repeated. They're meant to be remembered, carried like soft embers that warm you long after the fire fades. When I thought of her now, it wasn't with restlessness or conflict. It was with calm, with the simple acknowledgement that something rare had passed between us. Something I would hold close, not as a secret heavy with shame, but as a memory gentle with meaning. And in that acceptance, I found peace. The day she caught me watching hadn't just changed everything in the moment. It had left me with something lasting. A reminder that connection is possible in the smallest of gestures, in the quietest of silences, in the simplest of smiles. And though the world might never know, I would always remember. Weeks later, life seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. Classes, work, the endless cycle of daily obligations, they all carried on as if nothing had changed. And yet, for me, everything had. The memory of her lingered in quiet ways. Not in a restless ache anymore, but like a hidden thread woven through my days. Sometimes it surfaced in the smallest moments, the way sunlight cut through a window in the late afternoon, or how the quiet hum of running water in a sink could transport me instantly back to her kitchen. We didn't speak of it. Not directly. There were no confessions, no careful explanations. And maybe that was the beauty of it. It didn't need to be named to be real. What existed between us lived in the spaces between words, in the glances that lasted a second too long, in the subtle warmth of presence that said more than language ever could. When I saw her again, weeks after that day, nothing was staged or rehearsed. She greeted me as always, with her calm voice and steady smile. But beneath it, I felt the same current, quiet but undeniable. It was there in the way her eyes softened when they met mine, in the pause she allowed before turning back to her book, her task, her world. And I realized then, what tied us together wasn't about circumstance or daring. It was about recognition. She had seen me, truly seen me, and I had seen her. That was the thread that endured, delicate but unbreakable. At night, when I thought of her, it wasn't with longing that clawed or guilt that burned. It was with warmth. A warmth that reminded me of who I was in her eyes, someone worth pausing for, someone worth smiling at. She had shifted something in me, something that no ordinary day could have done. It struck me that not every story needs resolution in the way we expect. Not every bond is meant to be lived out in bold gestures or shouted from rooftops. Some bonds live in quiet memory, in the comfort of knowing they exist at all. And perhaps that's why this felt so timeless. It wasn't about an outcome. It was about a moment, carried forward like a flame that never fully goes out. As I stood at my window one evening, watching the sky fade from gold to indigo, I felt that same calm wash over me. The kind of calm I'd first noticed in her, the steadiness she carried even when her eyes revealed the quiet vulnerability beneath. It stayed with me. She stayed with me. Not in ways anyone else could see, but in ways that would last all the same. And I knew then, with a certainty that surprised me, the day she caught me watching had given me more than a memory. It had given me a bond, unspoken yet enduring, a quiet connection that would remain part of me, timeless, untouchable, and unforgettable.